Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange. Today I'm here to do another horror recommendation video. This time I'm focusing on survival horror, which is one of my all-time favorite genres. I have a pretty niche idea of what I consider to be survival horror because you could argue that pretty much every horror story is about surviving the end, whether it be against zombies or vampires, etc. But for this definition, I'm focusing on stories that have a real-life survival aspect to them, as we'll get to in a moment here, but whether it be running out of food or water or in the very dangerous cold. And it's a genre that I love a lot, but I'm actually surprised that I have not read more, or at least have not read more that I liked. So at the end of this video, I would love to get some recommendations from all of you, but for now, let's start with the books that I want to talk about. Let's get started. Now, first, if we're going to talk about survival horror, we have to talk about one of my all-time favorites, and that is The Ruins by Scott Smith. This involves a group of young college-age students that go off to party and vacation in Mexico. At first they stay around the resort, however they get pulled off the resort when a man asks them to help find his brother. Through a series of events, they end up going up a group of ruins, and once they're there, they end up being trapped. And I don't want to give away more of the plot, but just know that this, in my mind, is a classic example of what I consider to be survival horror. So you have a group of people who have a different dynamic between them. Some of them are in relationships, some of them don't really get along, and they are forced to put those relationships to the test, and those relationships become very strained once they're in a situation where they are basically trapped, and so they are running out of food and water. They need to get out of the situation, they need to get back to the resort and back home. And I will let you know, without giving away too much, that this book has some really gruesome scenes involving some body horror, which you know I love, but it's not for everyone, so keep that in mind. But this book is very fast-paced. The narrative is very gripping. You'll just be turning the pages. And again, I think if you've never read survival horror, this is a great place to start. It's a pretty popular one, but just in case you have not read it, highly recommend. Next, I want to recommend Stranded by Bracken McLeod, and this is a horror novel that follows a group of fishermen who are out fishing in Alaska when they get stuck in the ice. We follow a main character who blacks out at first, and when he wakes up, he finds that everyone is suffering from some unknown illness. On top of that, you have the general survival issues coming about. They have limited food, limited water, and again, because it's set in Alaska, you also get that cold element. And so once again, I'm happy that this book really addresses frostbite and just the dangers of going outside, that they need to be properly dressed for the weather. And I, again, always am a sucker for any time there's a shortage of food. I'm probably going to say it again in this video, but if you didn't know, that is a personal fear of mine. I am someone who overpacks no matter where I'm going. I keep multiple granola bars in my purse. I will pack for 5 days of food if we are going out for a day trip or a picnic to the park. I just find the idea of running out of food absolutely terrifying. So that's probably a big reason that horror stories like these work so well for me. So I did like those aspects here. Without giving away too much of the plot, I'll let you know that this is a survival story, but there is also more to the story than that. So if you're looking for a straight up survival story, please be aware that there is more going on, but I have to leave it there and keep it mysterious because I do not want to spoil the story for anyone else. But I really liked what that something else was. I thought this book was very engaging. Again, a page turner, and I just wanted to know what was going to happen, what was going on, why everyone was getting so sick. And eventually they have to leave their ship to explore the Alaskan landscape and try to find help. And it's just such a good story. So again, if you're looking for a great story to fall into, if you're in a reading slump and need to get out of one, this is a fantastic one to pick up. I really enjoy it. Again, just like Ronald Malfi, I think Bracken McLeod is another fantastic storyteller. From there, I want to recommend Suicide Forest by Jeremy Bates, and this follows a group of teachers that are living in Japan teaching English. They are on vacation for the weekend and are originally going up to some mountains. However, they get sidetracked and end up going into the forest in Japan that is known as Suicide Forest. The reason for that is that a large portion of people in Japan that are trying to commit suicide will go to this forest to do the job. And so they decide to go into the forest and camp there overnight. The cab driver who is with them warns them that this is a terrible idea, that the forest just should not be disturbed and they should just leave it alone. And of course, they do not take his advice, they go off, and the story goes from there. This is one I enjoyed for quite a few reasons. One being the fact that it is set in Japan, and while it's not written by a Japanese author, I really did enjoy getting to hear the different parts of Japanese culture that were woven into the book, the different traditions. Of course, in Japan, the suicide forest is a real thing. Suicide in general is a huge problem in Japan, and there is a eeriness around this forest, the idea that so many people go there to die. Also the fact that a lot of Japanese people do believe in ghosts, and so that is interwoven into the story, because as things start to go wrong, as they start to wonder if perhaps they are not alone, it's the question of whether or not there are actual other people out there or whether or not there's more of a supernatural explanation going on. And I will not tell you which way it goes because the suspense is half the enjoyment. But as you would expect, they end up getting lost, they get stuck in there, and so again you have to deal with shortages of food, water, and just them trying to get out of a situation that they are not at all prepared for. You also get the fantastic breakdown of the dynamics of the group. They are not necessarily friends to begin with, and you get to see the tensions rise. And I will admit that the characters kind of play into the different niches or stereotypes of a survival story. So there's kind of the really brute force guy, and there's like the girl with the backstory, and there's kind of all the little check boxes you would expect. But again, if you're new to the genre and have not read a lot of that, this is a good one to try out. Or if you're like me and just want to read more and more of these stories, I thought this one was really enjoyable. I had a lot of fun reading it. And again, half the suspense was trying to figure out what was actually going on. I also do want to acknowledge that while it deals with a really sensitive subject of suicide, I actually felt like those elements were well done, and the fact that the tone was very respectful towards people that do commit suicide, and really talked a lot about the mental health aspect surrounding depression that often will lead to this event. And so I do think that it was done in a very respectful way, given the fact that the author just could have skipped over those details and made this more of a goofy or silly aspect to the story, but instead he really pays respect to the fact that suicide is really a symptom or result of mental illness that is not being properly treated. So do have a lot of respect for the author there. And otherwise, it was just a very engaging story, very interesting, a little bit different with that Japanese focus. And as you can guess, because it's in this video, I would definitely recommend it. Next, I want to talk about The Terror by Dan Simmons, which is a piece of historical horror that is set in the 1800s following an expedition of sailors that went off to explore the Northwest Passage. They ended up getting stuck in Alaska, and in that situation, as you would expect, the survival aspects come into play as they have to ration food, water, survive the cold elements. And on top of that, because this is not just historical but also horror, there is possibly something out there that is coming for them. This book is very large, very long, and I did, for the most part, really enjoy it. I thought that it had really good elements of suspense, and again, really ticked a lot of the check boxes when it comes to the survival genre. But I think this one is a little bit different than most of the other ones on this list because of the fact that it's about a full crew and not just a few friends, and so you have a lot more people, a lot more potential perspectives, but along with that you also have a lot more people to die off. This book is brutal. There are definitely some terrible consequences that come from them being in the situation. Terrible things happen, people make awful choices, and again, if you're like me and are just terrified of the idea of of running out of food. This one definitely talks about them having to ration out not just the food but also the rum, because if people run out of alcohol, there can be problems there too. And I just thought this one was very engaging, very mysterious. And again, it's a chunky book, you have to commit to it, but if you're in the right space, if you're ready to take it on, it is a really good survival story. Finally, I cannot end out this video without discussing one of my personal favorites, and that is The Troop by Nick Cutter. This follows a group of Boy Scouts that are out tenting in the Canadian wilderness when a man who is voraciously hungry shows up. There is something wrong with him. At first they try to help him and do the good Boy Scout thing. However, things go terribly wrong, and eventually the group starts to fall apart and have to survive and try to get off of this little Canadian island. And oh my goodness, I love this book so much. This book is often described as a horror version of Lord of the Flies, and I do agree with that. You have a bunch of young boys that are really turning against each other and are just doing terrible things, making terrible choices. I also related quite a bit to the voraciously hungry man that shows up, because again, the idea of being hungry and not being able to fill that void, to me, is terrifying. I'm not sure that that personal connection was the author's intent, but I really liked getting inside his head and getting to see how truly hungry he was. And I think the author did a really good job of expressing the intensity of that hunger, because I felt that too in the past. And overall, this one is just great. It's brutal, it's dark. I do need to give content warnings for harm to animals. I often forget that, but for other people, I know that can be a big turnoff. But if you can get past that, if you're okay with a really gross book, because this book involves not only body horror, but definitely a lot of just gross out horror in general. I always say this is a book I cannot read while eating, but if you're in the mood for that, if you're okay putting down your sandwich to finish the book, this is definitely one to check out. If you have not read it, it's not one to skip. It's a little bit older now, but it's definitely worth coming back to if you've never read it yourself, or if you've read it, it might be time to do a reread, because I know I definitely need to pick it up again. So that is it for this video. As always, I'd love to hear of the books I mentioned. Which ones are you planning on picking up? And I would love, as I mentioned before, your recommendations for your favorite survival stories, because I would love to read more of them. It's honestly one of my favorite subgenres, and I was surprised that I didn't have more books to recommend this time around. So leave your comments down below. Otherwise, if you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror as well as thriller, science fiction, and fantasy. You can help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, hitting that notification bell, and sharing it around online with all your horror friends. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.